The Rise of Egyptian Wealth and the Foundations of Power c. 31.0121. BCE, ancient Egypt did not collapse because it lacked wealth, but because it misunderstood how wealth should be protected, diversified, and sustained. And this fatal mistake began at the very moment Egypt became rich, for from its unification around 3100 BCE under King Narmer, Egypt's economy was built almost entirely on a single miraculous advantage: the Nile River, which provided predictable floods, fertile soil, and agricultural surplus, unmatched anywhere in the ancient world, allowing Egypt to accumulate enormous grain reserves that functioned as both food security and currency, giving the pharaohs the ability to control labor, fund massive construction projects like pyramids and temples, maintain standing armies, and dominate regional trade routes across Nubia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Unlike Mesopotamia, which developed diversified trade economies due to environmental instability, Egypt grew complacent because the Nile always delivered. And this reliability created an illusion of eternal prosperity that shaped Egyptian political thinking, religious ideology, and economic policy. Where wealth was centralized entirely in the hands of the state and the temple system, with the pharaoh acting as both divine ruler and economic gatekeeper, gold from Nubia, copper from Sinai, incense from Punt, and grain exports to famine-stricken regions made Egypt one of the richest civilizations of the Bronze Age. But instead of reinvesting this wealth into technological innovation, commercial institutions, or flexible trade networks, Egypt locked its riches into monuments, priesthoods, and rigid bureaucracies. Believing that maintaining divine order was more important than adapting to changing global conditions, as centuries passed, Egyptian wealth became increasingly static, stored in tombs, temples, and state granaries, rather than circulating through an independent merchant class, which meant economic power could not respond quickly to shocks such as droughts, invasions, or trade disruptions. By the New Kingdom period c. 1550 to 1200 BCE, Egypt appeared unstoppable, with vast territories, immense gold reserves, and monumental architecture symbolizing eternal strength. Yet beneath the surface, this concentration of wealth, dependence on a single ecological system, and neglect of economic diversification planted the seeds of collapse. Because when the Nile faltered, foreign trade routes shifted, and military threats intensified, Egypt lacked the economic flexibility needed to survive, setting the stage for the single greatest wealth mistake in its history: the belief that abundance would last forever without adaptation. The wealth mistake: centralization, hoarding, and economic rigidity. c. 1200 to 900 BCE, the true wealth mistake that began unraveling the Egyptian empire was not a sudden disaster, but a slow, structural failure rooted in extreme centralization and hoarding of wealth, particularly during and after the late New Kingdom period, when Egypt faced growing external pressures and internal strain, yet its economic system remained frozen in traditions designed for stability rather than survival, because almost all surplus wealth, grain, gold, land, and labor, was controlled by either the royal administration or the temple institutions, especially the powerful priesthood of Amen at Thebes, which by the reign of Ramesses III controlled vast estates, fleets of ships, workshops, and tens of thousands of workers, effectively operating as a parallel state, draining resources from the crown while contributing little to economic innovation or defense. Instead of encouraging private trade or a merchant class that could adapt to changing Mediterranean economies, Egypt restricted commerce, taxed production heavily, and treated wealth circulation as a threat to divine order, ensuring that economic power remained static and vulnerable. When the Nile experienced irregular flooding in the late Bronze Age, agricultural output dropped, yet the bureaucracy responded not with reform but with increased taxation and forced labor, triggering shortages and unrest, culminating in the world's first recorded labor strike at Deir el-Medina around 1155 BCE, where royal tomb workers were left unpaid because state granaries were empty despite temples remaining rich, exposing a fatal imbalance in wealth distribution. At the same time, Egypt's reliance on state-funded armies meant that when revenue declined, military readiness collapsed, leaving borders exposed to Libyan incursions, Nubian resistance, and the destabilizing arrival of the Sea Peoples, whose raids disrupted trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean. Rather than adapting by opening trade, reforming taxation, or redistributing temple wealth, the Egyptian elite doubled down on monument building and religious endowments, believing ritual continuity would restore prosperity, but this only accelerated decline as wealth became increasingly locked in non-productive assets. While inflation rose due to grain shortages and barter devaluation, by the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt was still visibly rich in gold and temples, yet functionally bankrupt, unable to pay workers, maintain armies, or protect trade routes, proving that Egypt did not fall because it lacked wealth, but because it concentrated it too tightly, refused to let it circulate, and mistook stored abundance for economic strength, turning its greatest asset into the very force that undermined imperial survival. Foreign dependence, trade collapse, and the loss of economic sovereignty. See 905-25. BCE as Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, and later the Late Period. The long-term consequences of its wealth mismanagement became irreversible because the empire that once controlled its own resources, trade, and military power now found itself increasingly dependent on foreign actors to sustain systems it had failed to reform, marking the transition from dominant empire to economically compromised state. Since the collapse of centralized authority after the New Kingdom allowed regional elites, priesthoods, and military commanders to carve Egypt into semi-independent zones that competed rather than cooperated, fragmenting taxation and draining royal revenues. While international trade networks that once flowed through Egyptian-controlled ports shifted toward Phoenician and Greek intermediaries who were more flexible, commercially oriented, technologically adaptive. Egypt, which had historically viewed merchants as subordinate to the state, now relied on foreign traders for timber, iron, luxury goods, even grain during bad flood years, effectively surrendering pricing power and economic leverage to outsiders. While mercenaries, Libyan, Nubian, and later Greek were hired to compensate for declining native military capacity, creating armies loyal to pay rather than to the state. This reliance on foreign labor and military force further strained finances, forcing rulers to mortgage land, grant tax exemptions, and transfer economic privileges to mercenary leaders and temple institutions, hollowing out the fiscal base of the kingdom. Meanwhile, Egypt failed to adapt to the Iron Age transition that reshaped Mediterranean warfare and production, lagging behind rivals in metallurgy and shipbuilding, which weakened both its trade competitiveness and defensive capabilities, allowing Assyrian forces under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal to invade Egypt in the 7th century BCE, sack Memphis, and expose how far Egyptian power had declined, as a civilization once feared across continents could no longer defend its own heartland. Although Egypt briefly regained autonomy under the Sayyid dynasty, its economy remained dependent on Greek trade, foreign soldiers, and external demand, leaving it vulnerable to larger imperial systems. And when the Persian Empire invaded in 525 BCE under Cambyses II, Egypt fell rapidly not because it lacked manpower or wealth, but because it lacked economic sovereignty, strategic trade control, and institutional resilience, proving that the ultimate cost of Egypt's wealth mistake was the loss of independence itself. As riches accumulated without reform transformed Egypt from a self-sustaining empire into a resource-rich prize for more adaptive powers. Religious wealth, bureaucratic paralysis, and the failure to reform c. 525 to 332 BCE, after the Persian conquest. Egypt's final chance to recover imperial power was lost, not through violence alone, but through a deeply rooted inability to reform institutions that had been shaped by centuries of wealth concentration, religious authority, and bureaucratic rigidity. Because even as foreign rulers took control, Egypt's internal systems remained frozen in tradition. Vast economic resources still locked inside temples, priesthoods, and administrative layers that prioritized ritual continuity over adaptability, meaning that wealth continued to exist but no longer served Egyptian autonomy or innovation. The Persian administration allowed temples to retain land and privileges in exchange for political stability, reinforcing the same structural imbalance that had weakened Egypt earlier, while Egyptian elites clung to ancient models of governance, believing that restoring old rituals would restore old power, ignoring the reality that the global economy had shifted toward coinage, commercial law, merchant classes, and military technological competition. Egypt's refusal to modernize its taxation system, decentralize economic power, or encourage independent commercial growth meant that wealth could not be mobilized quickly for defense or development. And as a result, rebellions against Persian rule repeatedly failed because insurgents lacked sustainable funding and institutional support. Even though Egypt remained agriculturally productive and culturally cohesive, meanwhile, Greek city-states and later Macedon developed flexible economies driven by trade, monetization, and military professionalism, allowing them to convert resources into power far more efficiently than Egypt's temple-centered model. And when Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a moment that symbolized how thoroughly Egyptian elites had accepted foreign rule as inevitable, preferring stability under outsiders to reform under native leadership. By this point, Egypt's wealth had become ceremonial rather than strategic, preserved in religious spectacle and monumental memory, while real economic power flowed through foreign-controlled trade routes, currencies, and armies, demonstrating that the final stage of Egypt's collapse was not invasion, but institutional stagnation, where immense resources existed without the mechanisms needed to convert them into sovereignty, resilience, or future growth. The final lesson: how Egypt's wealth became its weakness, 332 BCE, and beyond the fall of the Egyptian Empire, was not the result of a single conquest, famine, or military defeat, but the long-term consequence of a fundamental misunderstanding of wealth itself, because Egypt treated riches as something to be preserved rather than something to be mobilized, diversified, and transformed. And this mindset ensured that even when Egypt possessed fertile land, gold reserves, cultural unity, and a historical prestige, it lacked the institutional flexibility required to survive in a changing world, as wealth remained concentrated in temples, bureaucracy, and monumental memory instead of circulating through innovation, trade expansion, and adaptive governance. Under Greek and later Roman rule, Egypt continued to generate immense agricultural surplus, becoming the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Yet this productivity benefited foreign empires rather than restoring Egyptian sovereignty, proving that resource abundance alone does not guarantee power if control mechanisms are externalized. The true wealth mistake was Egypt's refusal to decentralize economic authority, encourage an independent merchant class, adopt monetized economies early, or reform institutions when environmental and geopolitical realities shifted. Choices driven by a belief that divine order and historical continuity could substitute for strategic adaptation. Egypt's story reveals a universal pattern seen across civilizations, where early success breeds complacency, stability discourages innovation, and wealth becomes locked in systems designed to protect the past rather than build the future, leaving societies vulnerable to more flexible rivals. The ultimate irony is that Egypt did not disappear because it was poor, but because it remained rich in the wrong way, preserving abundance without resilience, tradition without reform, and memory without power, offering a timeless warning that empires do not fall when their wealth runs out, but when their understanding of wealth fails to evolve with the world around them. The fall of the Egyptian Empire was not the result of a single invasion, drought, or ruler's failure, but the long-term consequence of a fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth truly is and how it must function to sustain power. Because Egypt treated wealth as something to be stored, sanctified, and preserved, rather than mobilized, diversified, and strategically reinvested, and this mindset turned abundance into stagnation. For over 2 millennia, Egypt believed that control of the Nile, accumulation of grain, and possession of gold guaranteed eternal stability. Yet when environmental fluctuations disrupted agriculture, when trade routes shifted, and when military technology evolved, Egypt lacked the institutional flexibility to respond. As its wealth was locked inside temples, monuments, rigid bureaucracies that could not be converted quickly into innovation or defense, unlike rising powers that encouraged merchant classes, monetized economies, and adaptive military systems, Egypt resisted change in the name of tradition and divine order, allowing more dynamic civilizations to outpace it despite having fewer natural resources. And by the time Egypt recognized the need for reform, economic sovereignty had already been surrendered to foreign traders, mercenaries, and administrators. Under Greek and later Roman rule, Egypt remained extraordinarily wealthy, serving as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. Yet its wealth no longer belonged to Egypt itself, proving that riches alone do not protect empires' control, adaptability, and circulation do. The real wealth mistake that ended the Egyptian empire was the belief that stability was strength, when in reality, survival depends on transformation. And Egypt's story stands as one of history's most powerful warnings that even the richest civilizations can fall if they fail to evolve, leaving behind monuments of greatness, but surrendering the future to those who understand how to turn wealth into lasting power.